Welcome. I'm Sherry Goodman, Director of Education here at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, and I'm extremely happy to welcome you to our program today, which is occasioned by the museum's retrospective exhibition of the work of Charles Howard. And now to Alexander Nemerov, who is a celebrated author, curator, public speaker, and professor at Stanford University, where he chairs the Department of Art and Art History. This spring, Professor Nemerov delivered the 66th Annual Andrew Mellon Lectures at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. His close readings of visual artworks have meaningfully opened pathways of understanding for his students and readers and have reinforced the relevance of the humanities in our civic and personal lives. So now I will turn it over to Professor Nemerov, whom I'm so delighted could join us.
Thank you all for being here. It's an honor for me, I think, because the show is so great. I mean, it's not just that the art is good, and it's not even just that the art is good and that the curation is impeccable. It's just, it's the story of it, that taking this artist and kind of giving him life, giving him the right and proper life that he deserves. It's an example of art history at its best. So our first speaker is the curator, Apsara DiQuinzio, and during her 5-year tenure here at this museum, she's organized numerous exhibitions, most recently the very one you've just heard praised. In addition to being curator of modern and contemporary art here, she also oversees, as we've heard, the Matrix program for contemporary art and has organized over 15 solo exhibitions, including those of the artists Nicole Eisenman, John Zurier, Geta Braitascu, Eric Baudelaire, Tarek Atawi, Otabong Nakanga, Cecilia Idafok, and Michael Armitage. Apsara previously worked at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, where she organized major group exhibitions, including ones called 6 Lines of Flight, Shifting Geographies in Contemporary Art, and then another one called The Air We Breathe, Artists and Poets Reflect on Marriage Equality. In addition to solo exhibitions with Tricia Donnelly, Vincent Fectu, R.H. Quaitman, and Paul Saitzima. Prior to SF MoMA, she worked at the Whitney Museum of American Art, where she co-organized the 2004 Whitney Biennial, among other exhibitions. Apsara has contributed to many exhibition catalogs and journals, including Art Forum, Cura, and The Exhibitionist. So please welcome Apsara DiQuinzio.
Thank you all for coming. It was a pleasure for me to organize this exhibition, which was about 5 years in the making, 3 to 5 years. Charles Howard had a distinguished career that spanned 5 decades. He was included in a number of momentous exhibitions, including Julian Levy's seminal 1932 exhibition, Surrealism, which of course introduced New York audiences to Surrealism. He was also in the International Surrealist Exhibition in London in 1936, and in both of those exhibitions, he was one of only 3 Americans in those exhibitions. And then later on, he was included in Peggy Guggenheim's Art of the Century in 1942. And then, of course, there were many others in many leading institutions, such as MoMA in New York, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Met, et cetera, et cetera. But despite being affiliated with many of those exhibitions and the leading movements of his time, and exhibiting with renowned artists such as Kandinsky and Ozenfant and Gabo and Pevner, who you're seeing in this image, as well as Man Ray and Ben Nicholson, he is relatively unknown to today's audiences, which is an interesting conundrum. And so I like to start with this image because I think it emblematizes that conundrum in an interesting way. So this is, of course, the one of the Bernice Abbott installation shots of Art of the Century from 1942. And it's the Abstract and Cubist Gallery. And here you have all the artists I just mentioned, Kandinsky in the foreground. And then in the back, tilting downward, next to the Alexander Calder mobile, is Charles Howard's painting Prefiguration. And there's just enough of it showing that you can make it out. And so this exhibition, so there he is beyond our peripheral field of vision and really understanding. And so this exhibition was really an attempt to bring him into the foreground and bring him into historical focus. And so here is a reproduction of that painting that was reproduced in the catalog, which is how we are able to identify it today, because it is now, the location is unknown. So I'm going to focus my remarks in this presentation on the early portion of his career primarily. The Howards were a family of artists and architects. John Galen Howard, Charles's father, was hired by Phoebe Apperson Hearst and President Wheeler to be the supervising architect of the campus in 1901. And here you have a picture of the family together from 1902, when they had just moved to Berkeley from Montclair, New Jersey. And you have, of course, John Galen and Mary Howard, and then their 4 sons. Their daughter was not yet born. John Langley Howard is sitting in Mary Howard's lap. He's the youngest. And then Henry Temple is next to his father, and he, of course, would become an architect. And Robert Howard is on the left of his mother, and he would, of course, become a sculptor. And John Langley would also become a painter. And then there in the front is Charles Howard with a cute little bow. And so the Howards were a prominent family and really became known as the first family of Bay Area modernism. So they were both artists. Mary Howard was a painter and a pianist. And John Galen Howard was, of course, an architect and was responsible for many of the buildings on this campus, including Souther Tower, which is pictured here. And then you have one of Mary Howard's lovely watercolors on the left here. And I think what's remarkable about this is you see the expressive nature of her work, and then the sort of orderly neoclassical architecture of John Galen Howard. And I think those things would sort of come together in Charles Howard's work. But other buildings that John Galen Howard made on campus included the Hearst Memorial Mining Building, the Greek Theater, Doe Library, Bolt Hall, Wheeler Hall, et cetera, et cetera. And he also founded the architecture department here at Berkeley. So Charles went to Berkeley High School and then also to the university here, and received a degree in journalism in 1921, and he thought he would become a writer, and then briefly pursued graduate studies at Columbia and Harvard for a year, and then took off for Europe for several years. And it was in Europe that he met Grant Wood, the painter, the regionalist painter Grant Wood, and it's been written that they traveled around Italy together for a summer around 1923, and during which time Wood preached the superiority of paint over words as a medium of self-expression. So here's young Howard thinking about becoming a writer, and Wood is talking about the superiority of painting. We learn from a letter dated 1923, sent from France to Howard's father, that he had already, in fact, begun experimenting with watercolor. And so he sort of says at the end of that, here's another artist pop. So he was the one son who wasn't going to be an artist, of course, who's now thinking about pursuing his career as a painter. So while he was in Italy, he visited the small town of Castelfranco, just north of Venice, about an hour north, and he saw this altarpiece by Giorgione. which led to a kind of epiphany that he writes about much later in 1946. I think it's also important to know that he had already sort of decided he was already experimenting it before. But I just wanted to read you a little bit about that experience because it was so significant to him. He says, "I looked at the picture for a quarter of an hour. I looked at nothing else. It may be that I thought of all other pictures I had been looking at in Italy when I had been spending time in galleries that should by all rights have been spent on something else, writing a novel, say. It may be that I ruminated on the somber, analytical, philosophical approach of the Florentine painters, and then on the free, warm, romantic fervor of Venice. I think it is fairly certain that I realized even in those few moments that here in this picture before me was a combination of both these approaches, that here for once was a synthesis." So that's what he talks about as being this sort of incredible moment. And then he goes on and he writes about running out of the building and getting sick to his stomach. It's a very powerful aesthetic experience. And then dropping everything and moving to Paris and becoming a painter. But I think there are some interesting aspects of this painting to sort of pause on and reflect on. One, because they will reappear in much of Howard's work later on. One is the flag that St. Nicasius is holding, which adds a certain dynamism to the composition, which is fairly symmetrical. The other is this sort of tension that's created between this Sacra Conversazione style, between interior and exterior space. So you have these sort of window-like forms in the back that give you a distant horizon line into the background. You have the Trinity, that's sort of tripartite structure within the canvas, and he will later go on to paint trinities, what he refers to as his trinities. So the structure of the composition. Like he said, the importance of this synthesis, this coming together of all of these different elements. A sense of a frozen moment in time, which you see in a lot of his paintings. And of course, Giorgione was known for being such an enigmatic painter who didn't disclose the subjects of his works necessarily. And he bridged sort of the sacred and the profane in his work. So that mystery, I think, also filters into Howard's work later on. After he leaves Italy and Paris, he moves to New York, and he settles in Greenwich Village, and this is in about 1925. And in order to make a living, he starts working at the decorating firm of Louise Boucher and Rudolf Gertler, and teaching himself how to paint and learning his new vocation. And he executed many site-specific commissions at that time. And here on the screen, you see a reproduction of some of his murals that he did in the private home of Hobart G. Irwin. And you can see this sense of neoclassicism and fragmentation that is in his work. He also joins the Whitney Studio Club in around 1925. And it's at the Whitney Studio Club where he will have his first solo exhibition in 1926. And that was, of course, kind of the epicenter of modernism in New York at the time, and where leading artists such as Edward Hopper, Reginald Marsh, Charles Sheeler, John Stewart Curry, Alexander Calder, and Louise Boucher, and many, many other artists were all members and involved with the Whitney Studio Club. So he was really sort of at that center, at an important center. And this is the kind of work that he was making around that time. And he was working in this satirical mode, making these very figurative drawings. And so this gives you a sense of what was included in that exhibition. This is a painting by Alexander Calder that kind of records that moment in time. And I have to say I was so excited when I stumbled across this painting because, and Alexander Calder said, you know, he didn't really care for the painting, but he gave it to the Whitney Museum of American Art, hoping that it might at a certain point in time become an interesting record of that time. And here, lo and behold, you have, so the painting is commemorating this festive party after the third solo exhibition of Brancusi at the Brummer Gallery in New York in 1926. And you have all the members of the Whitney Studio Club around the table, and in the center you have Charles and Robert Howard swinging around the fireman's pole. And then Louise Boucher is orating at the table. Alexander Calder's dancing on the bench and behind. And you probably have Brancusi at the center with his back to the audience in this Cossack hat. So again, another record of Howard at that moment. In 1928, he was in an exhibition with his other two brothers, Robert Howard and Langley Howard, that occurred here in San Francisco. That his mother helped to organize with Beatrice Ryan, who opened the gallery Beaux-Arts, and it was one of the first modernist galleries on the West Coast. And so here you have him riffing. It's a very ironic portrayal of a kind of luncheon on the grass genre that Manet and Titian would have done. And instead of a female reclining nude here, you have him and his two brothers in swimming suits and their bald heads. Which you saw in Calder's painting before. So I think it shows that he has a lot of humor as well. And then this is a kind of intermediary style where he's moving from that satirical mode and into abstraction. And I think it shows the influence of Cubism and this sort of strong centralized composition. And he's blending these eras. It's called 1826 into 1926. And you have these neoclassical motifs, which of course are holdovers, perhaps from his father. And then in the 30s, he starts making what we would consider his more mature work. And he starts painting beach scenes for the most part. But there's strange things happening on the beach that are not quite identifiable. And in this work, I should also say that from early 1900s until the 1920s, the Howard family spent their summers in Carmel on the beach. And Jeanette Howard recalls them walking to Point Lobos and seeing fishermen living in the rocks and seeing fishing nets strewn about the beaches and the rocks. And so fishing nets are a common motif. And then this rock sort of reminds me of Point Lobos in a weird way. And then, of course, this outstretched foot. And then you see this seashell and this sort of curvilinear form emerging from it, which of course brings to mind the birth of Venus. But he's revisiting these neoclassical subjects in a fresh, modern way. And how am I doing on time? Okay. So Howard once said that in all of his works were closely related. They are in fact all portraits of the same subject, of the same idea, carried as far as I'm able at the time. So, but he never discloses what that subject is. So, of course, he's creating this sort of enigmatic idea that pervades his work. But I think in looking closely at his work, there are three things that sort of jump out, and I would say are subjects that all of his work is about. And one is an extraordinary sense of balance. Everything is sort of hovering in space, perhaps on the brink of collapse. It's this frozen moment in time. And another is this synthesis of oppositional forces, whether it's abstraction or surrealism, the organic or the man-made, and order and chaos. So he's really bringing together these oppositional forces and knitting them together in this synthetic moment. And then there's always something strange and mysterious that's transpiring in front of us. So there's this, it's as if we're on this moment of an epic metamorphosis or transformation, but everything is so controlled. at the same time. So that is what I would consider his subject to be, among other things. So this is an example of his later work in the 40s, but in it you can see many things that are characteristic of much of his work. And one is this sort of porthole or keyhole or window or aperture that he creates, and with this horizon line in the distance, which we saw in the Giorgione altarpiece. And then we have these mysterious biomorphic forms, these red lips, or it's sort of amoeba-like form, and then these other strange dripping bodies, which perhaps could be an underwater sea fantasy or the interior of a ship of some kind. And here, again, you see those earlier motifs like the feet and the flags, but here they're stretched out across the top of the composition, and then you have sort of the bottom imprint of the foot stretching across as well. And then all sorts of strange figures happening in space, and again, the aperture behind. And then the palette is interesting. I'm not sure if I mentioned that in relation to the Giorgione painting, but the reds and the greens that were in the center of that composition appear in the center of many of Howard's work. And, you know, the Madonna was wearing this brilliant green robe. And then here you have the subject of balance that's really coming to the fore here, where you have this character who's holding a balancing pole that's linking together these two sides of the composition and these affinity forms that turn into these sort of seascapes. And this is the last slide I'll show. And this is the Aimant from 1949, which again brings together many of these things. And here you have this sort of subterranean form or forms, and to me they look somewhat like animals, perhaps a seal that's balancing this crescent moon on its nose, and then an ant perhaps that's coming up through the tunnel into this glaring red sky. And of course the aimant in French means the magnet or lovers. So everything is sort of suspended with these polar magnetic forces in space, and who knows what's about to happen next. So I think I will end my remarks there.
Okay, thank you, Apsara. So our second speaker today is Douglas Dreishpoon, and he is the Chief Curator Emeritus at the Albright-Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo and the Director of the Catalogue Raisonné of Helen Frankenthaler's work at the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation in New York. His essays, interviews, and reviews have appeared in numerous magazines and journals, including Art in America, Art Journal, Art News, Archives of American Art Journal, and the journal called Sculpture. And his recent exhibitions with publications include one called Imperfections by Chance, about the artist Paul Feely, who was actually my dad's best friend back in the day. Another one called Giving Up Your Mark, Helen Frankenthaler in the 1960s and 1970s. And another exhibition called Nothing and Everything, 7 Artists, 1947 to 1962. Douglas is a former board member of the American section of the International Association of Art Critics, and he holds a PhD from the Graduate School of the City University of New York. Please welcome Douglas Dreishpoon.
I wrote an essay on Howard 25 years ago. Sherry dug it up and got in touch with me and said, would you like to join this symposium? And I said, you know, that was a long time ago. I'm extremely happy to be here. It's amazing how when you put something out in the world, it will come back to you in very unexpected ways. When I looked at Howard's work 25 years ago, I saw certain things which immediately resonated the moment I got back to it. But I began to see it also with new eyes, and that's the brilliance of revisiting a subject that you thought you knew, or at least you knew at the time, anew. So I've got 15 slides. I'm going to go through them fairly broad strokes. I'm not going to settle in on on any one slide, but I do want to use all of the slides as a way to, pose questions about Howard. I have no definitive answers, only questions. It's just my nature, call it existential at best, but there you have it. So a good place to start is with excavation. Howard's art seems to be an art of symbols, an art of metaphors. When he hits his mature stride, he develops a lexicon of forms that are multivalent, polyvalent. They aren't necessarily what you expect them to be. Initially, they tend to be very sculptural, and I think we'll see that because he was involved with Unit 1 and knew Henry Moore early on, that the sculpture was something that was of great interest to him. And so forms are modeled in space. We see that. That begins to level out and flatten out as time goes on in very interesting ways. There's also this horizon line, which Apsara mentioned, and I think is very interesting because the horizon line immediately creates a landscape somewhat setting. It grounds things in a certain way. It tethers things to a certain kind of almost naturalistic space. That will vanish as well. And when that vanishes or when that disappears, things get very interesting. The excavation, to my mind, what is that? What are we excavating? What's happening? Apsara spoke about a portal, a hole, a ditch. Is it the excavation as an authentic naturalistic excavation, or is it the excavation as the investigation of the interior of something? And Howard's art, if it's anything, is an art of the mind. And so the excavation to me is a metaphor, a deep metaphor for digging deep into the psyche and ferreting out that which is his subject. I have to say, I think the subject is him, obviously, but him in a very poetic, broad, diffuse, and constantly evolving way. There are the formal aspects of the art, and then there are the personal aspects. Both are terribly interesting. There are also the banners, which are markers. They're very distinct markers. They're not just forms. They're things that declare a point, a thing. So what are those? How do we look at those? Then there are those quirky lines. They come up again and again and again, and they're here extremely early on, which is why I'm showing it. We're going to look at those because they're going to continue to come up. Paul Nash. Unit 1, obviously, it was an organization. It was a loose, union of artists, architects, fine artists, sculptors. There were about 7 or 8 members. It dealt with architecture, design, and modern art. It was a perfect meeting place of minds, and Howard was a part of this. Paul Nash basically was one of the front runners of this organization out of London. They were deeply invested in Surrealism, and so the question of what is Surrealism to Charles Howard? What did it mean? What did it offer him? It liberated his mind, obviously, as it liberated many artists' mind. But I put up the Nash because they're different. Surrealism had different tenets, right? So Salvador Dali came to represent a very narrative, magic realist approach to Surrealism. Howard was more interested in Surrealism as a way to ferret out the poetry of the mind, not through realistic subjects, but through forms and symbols and metaphors. The difference between portals and holes, portals and ditches. Nash as an example of the more magic realist, and something that Howard obviously knew about, but departed from fairly radically. Henry Moore was someone that opened up his eyes to the possibilities of a figuration that was not overtly representational, and a figuration that was constantly morphing, a figuration that deferred to the possibilities of internal form and external form. So this is an early piece from that time. It's part of the Albright-Knox's collection. Obviously, I'm going to show you a lot of Albright-Knox things because that's mother's milk to me. It's in a lot of ways. But the figure is there here in this context with Moore to point out that the figure was an important part of Howard's work, but it was there as a constantly evolving and ever morphing, attitude towards humanism. And Peter Seltz is in the audience. He did this brilliant show called New Images of Man in 1959, a completely radical show for the time because abstract expressionism was what everybody was looking at, but Peter was very interested in the figure, in images of men and women, of humans, so that I put this up also to represent that humanistic aspect that's writ into the use of a figure. The other interesting thing about Henry Moore is he starts to use yarn and thread. So those odd lines in Howard's work, I have a feeling that, I'm only suggesting these poetic affinities. There's no, the art historian in me long ago ditched 1 = 1, right? So it's not about that. It's more about what artists see and what registers in their consciousness and what then comes to bear in their work in ways that were never necessarily intended. So Moore starts using thread. He starts using yarn. There's a methodical nature to it, but there's an incredible whimsy to it as well. The abstraction of Moore's forms, too, this kind of Arpian notion of art is a fruit, I think is really important because it's, again, there were microcosmic, macrocosmic, internal, external reference to the human form. We've seen this slide, but I'm putting it on again because I want you to focus on the lines and the ropes. And this is Kiesler. And what's important to note about Kiesler is that if there's a person that would embody Unit 1's desire to merge architecture, design, and modern art, Kiesler had it in spades. He was the guy. He was not underappreciated, but he navigated in the art world in somewhat quiet ways because his art never got out there in ways that it could have. But he was there and he was a presence. And the ropes are used here to install paintings, but the paintings, if not subordinate, are part of a bigger complex, a bigger space that's architectural as well as illusionistic. But this is the slide, okay? This is Duchamp. Now, Kiesler and Duchamp are the same month. So this installation and the Art of the Century installation were the same month in 1942, which I'm fascinated by. It's actually the reverse order. So Duchamp was first and Kiesler was second, but it doesn't matter for our purposes. What matters is that this is a Labertine, madcap Labertine. This is like Ariadne on LSD, right? It's a complete violation of the work that's in the space, in a way. And it's intended to disorient you. I put it up again as a sign of how lines can function and how Howard's lines function. And it's the whimsy and the eccentricity of the lines that appealed to me and vis-a-vis now bears on Howard potentially. Howard's lines could be as sharp as a razor and as wispy as the wind. He drew like an angel. The lines could be incredibly precise and architectonic, and they could also be incredibly, eccentric and whimsical and erratic, in fact. So this is an example of just to show that that drawing had a certain precision, and he was very precise. I mean, he knew when he went to paint an image where it was coming from because he had sketched it out very methodically. But I think there was another part to him. There was another aspect to him. And while he never became a gestural abstractionist, it wasn't in his nature, and the paintings are incredibly intimate. They fly in the face of heroic Rothkos and Pollocks. It's the complete antithesis. But there was a side to him that wanted to stretch out. And I think that's what the lines enabled him to do when he allowed them to do it. There's also that horizon line, and he uses that again and again. It's almost as though the horizon line, and it may have been a Giorgione conceit. I mean, I'm willing to go with that. But I think in his case, it gave him, it centered and it stabilized the picture for a very long time. That is his images. But it disappears at a point, right? And this is an example of that. So what happens when it disappears? What does the space become? And how does he structure the space? there's this trinity that Apsara mentioned, fascinated by that. I'm also fascinated that the human beings in the altarpiece, the Giorgione, are 2 men and 1 woman. I think that's important. It poses certain questions about gender. It poses certain questions about relationships. The trinities are about relationships. They're about how forms interact. They're also, without that horizon line, a frieze. So if there's a classical dimension, and this is almost like the Parthenon, it's about the frieze that moves across the surface of a space that's endless and boundless. The cage is an important thing. There's this claustrophobia, and so the use of blacks becomes important, and black will become a dominant color as time goes on. And as he nears the end of his life cycle, black reappears with a great potency and poignancy. So there's the figuration, there's the banners. Each of the slides I've selected has the 3, the lines. There are those quirky lines again. And every time the lines appear, they appear in a different context and take on a different kind of meaning. And the banners now are blue. And are they banners? What are they? They're suddenly disassociated and flown. They're like radical free agents up there. But they declare and mark, which is super important. Okay, I couldn't help but throw in the Miro. 1, because I've spent so much time with it at the Albright-Knox, and 2, it's a look at that horizon line, which brings us to the notion of space. And as an abstract artist, how do you maintain space? Formally speaking, not symbolically. How does space function? In Miro's case, he uses that as the interior of a room and pokes a window as a portal, which opens up the space into another space. But it's full of this, it's full of humor, and it's full of eros, and it's full of whimsy. And Howard had that also. You have to look for it, but it appears and it's there. It's not all serious. There are the other levels to the way that he worked. Also one of my favorites. There is no sexier painting than The Liver is the Cock's Comb. And you can prove me wrong. I'm up for anything, but I think this is a killer painting. And there are a couple of things about it vis-a-vis Howard that I think are interesting and as a matter of note. There again, Gorky struggled with this as I think Howard began to struggle with it. As you flatten things out a little bit, that is, as your forms become less sculptural, and you position them in a space that's fairly nondescript, how do you maintain the tension between 3-dimensional and 2-dimensional? It's an interesting and tantalizing challenge. Gorky, the coloristic aspects, and this is one of Gorky's most painterly paintings. I mean, he was capable of doing that, and he did it on occasion, but often color is added almost in touches and minimally, but this is full of color. But it's the eros that I really wanted to draw your attention to, and I think the obfuscation of the obvious doesn't mitigate eros. So if you look closely and you allow your imagination to dream a little bit, the painting maintains that quality, not overtly. This idea of markers, this idea of a personage in a kind of landscape space, and something that Howard, we see him dealing with figuration. It continues with something that Tanguy also dealt with. There's one read and an interpretation of Tanguy's work of this ilk, that they were grave markers because they were, wartime images. And I think that's interesting. I think as memorials in the landscape with shadows, they take on kind of an interesting connotation. But this idea of cobbling together a figure, which like a Noguchi slate piece is held together by loose glue, or in fact is held together just because the weight of the forms end up holding them together. But it's precarious at best. Okay, back to Howard. When the space becomes less descriptive, less naturalistic, something cosmologic happens. The labyrinthine aspects of the Duchampian installation come to bear in pictures that, in spite of their size, are incredibly complicated and cobbled together by forms that are now threatening, dark, troublesome. And yet, I mean, there are aspects of figuration. There's also this kind of the balance that Apsara spoke about, I think, is a little more complicated, because I see that balance as a tension point, you know, where things square off against each other, right? And there's the triad, the trio, and the trinity on the one hand, but there's also this bipolar tension on the other hand. So what is that? What do we make of that metaphorically? If it's about relationships, what do those relationships mean, and how do we interpret formally the metaphor? There's also the light, and the light in a Howard painting continues to evolve. The light becomes more supernatural. But there's something also about it which I began thinking about, which it's highly keyed. In other words, the saturation of the color, it's retinal searing is one way to describe it. So there's something over the top. And I use the word kitsch not to demean the work, but only to describe how hot and high-keyed the colors are, and to bring your minds to the possibility of sci-fi, okay? That, and a kind of almost like stage sets for, for something that's far more dramatic. As a point of contrast, I want us to look at Rothko, because there's also, this is light. This is all about light and color. But in a way, it differentiates, and it helps us differentiate Howard from the New York School of Abstract Expressionism, which I hate that term anyway, but, you know, the New York School of Artists, a loose affiliation of individuals who attempted to paint a different kind of painting, a more gestalt, in some instances simpler image, but an image that was full of light and clarity, and Rothko being that, the epitome of that kind of a spiritual light, you know. Howard's light is not that, it's a light, but it's not that kind of light. It's a different kind of light. So that's something to think about as well. This is a curious slide, and you're probably wondering, why is this here? Theodore Roszak is the sculptural, he's the sculptural analog to Howard. So Roszak was a constructivist, like Ben Nicholson and Barbara Hepworth of Unit 1 early on. He dealt with clean forms, Bauhaus, kind of utopian an ethos. After the war, he bailed, and he decided that the world, after they dropped both bombs, was entirely dysfunctional. And the disquiet and the precarious and vulnerable nature of the human condition was something that he wanted to mine. So the forms become threatening, they become atavistic, they become primordial. And those forms are the very forms that appear in Howard's work later on. So this is the affinity, right? It's the atavistic, it's the primordial, it's the part of human nature that is threatening rather than, obsequious or quiet. All right, and just to end on the note where I'm talking about kind of, cinematic color in Howard's case, this kind of Hollywood notion, I couldn't help but bring in Godzilla, because when the war ended, the cultural imagination was suddenly, it spun out into very paranoid vectors. And so in Japan, of course, Godzilla became the monster from the Black Lagoon, and suddenly this primordial force rises up and begins to threaten human culture. So Howard, in a way, I think was sensitive to those issues of threat, of vulnerability, of the darker forces that were now, bearing in on the world. Thank you.
Okay. Having called for darkness, I can't see, but that's all right. I'm intrepid, though. I'm going to go on. Look, see, I just adjusted this a little bit, like art history on the fly. Okay, so Lauren Kroiz is our third speaker, and she's an associate professor in the history of art department here at UC Berkeley. And she's a faculty curator of the paintings, photographs, and works of art on paper at the university's Phoebe Hearst Museum of Anthropology. Her teaching and research focus on the 20th century art of the United States. She's the author of a book published in 2012 called Creative Composites, Modernism, Race, and the Stieglitz Circle, and Cultivating Citizens. The regional work of art in the New Deal era is a book that's due out in the spring. Her essay, which is called Charles Howard, Intermediate Genius, is included in the catalog for the exhibition we're discussing. Lauren is also the Terra Foundation Visiting Professor in American Art at the Freie University in Berlin for the current academic year. She'll be departing for Berlin very shortly. So please welcome Lauren Kroiz.
You were serious about the darkness up here. Okay. We've got this. Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone. I want to begin by thanking Apsara and also by calling up my own PowerPoint. Which is now ready, I believe. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to begin by echoing thanks to Apsara for bringing such an interesting artist and body of work to all of our attention. I learned a lot about Charles Howard writing an essay for her exhibition catalog, and you see the title page and the cover on my slide here. So this afternoon I'm going to try to distill my findings and give you a sense of the chapter of Howard's life sort of coming after Apsara's talk, the chapter of Howard's life from about 1933 to 1942. So from about the date of Banner, which you see on the left, to Prescience on the right. And I'll be considering his move to London and the ways in which he worked between Europe and the United States, and also between the styles of abstraction and surrealism. So in 1933, Howard married and moved to London with his second wife, the English painter Madge Knight. And he quickly joined there a divided European avant-garde, which was awash in competing schools of abstraction, surrealism, expressionism, and realism, among the other aesthetic agendas of that age. Influential English writer and critic Herbert Reed included Howard's painting Rumour, a painting that's now lost, in his 1948 edition of Art Now, which Reed first published in 1933, and he continually revised to try to survey contemporary art. So Rumour, Howard's now lost painting, was featured alongside artworks including German surrealist painter Max Ernst's Zoomorphic Couple from 1933, English geometric abstractionist Ben Nicholson's Carved Relief from 1935, Pablo Picasso's The Bather from 1929, and British sculptor Henry Moore's Composition from 1931. So even in this relatively small, poor black and white reproduction, I think we can note that Howard's artwork shares the biomorphic forms of Picasso and Moore, yet his dark floating forms towering above that low horizon line also suggest both the psychological unease of Ernst and also the clearly delineated geometries of Nicholson. Reed himself, the critic, engaged with such divisions in the 1930s, arguing that the polemical avant-gardes were not the most productive way to frame the artistic landscape. Following World War I, Reed wrote, individual artists had arrived at differing extremes, as he called them, citing the work of the surrealist Ernst and the abstractionist Nicholson as evidence of these two extremes in the artistic landscape. He described them as representatives of wings that seemed incapable of touching each other. And Reed pointed to the distance between these two styles, but he urged audiences to focus on the fact that, quote, the space between them is occupied by an unbroken series, quote, end quote. And by that he means an unbroken series of artists that don't belong to either of these schools. So in contrast, Reed positioned Picasso and Moore as intermediate artists. And this description at first, I thought, well, we know these guys, they're like geniuses of the age. I thought that intermediate suggested a kind of middling quality or contribution. But Reed assured readers that these artists were actually, quote, among the most evidently in possession of a fertile and powerful genius, end quote. It was their very in-betweenness that was an indication that they had avoided the doctrinal attitudes associated with any particular school. So unlike these other four artists, Howard was not featured in the numerous earlier or later printings of Art Now. This was his one and only appearance. We can see Howard's genius, thus between the dominant schools of abstraction and surrealism, but this is also an intermediate zone where it passed through the cracks in the art world and also in the history of modernism, a history that's so often propelled by categorization and classification. Banner, which you see here, is a difficult painting to classify. It dates from Howard's first year in London, 1934. Banner resembles the heavily textured gouaches, which you can see on display and which Howard was creating in New York. It's got a similar space of brown ground and blue sky that become bleaker with darker washes. You can see here two blocky rectilinear forms that tower on the painting's right side, casting long shadows. One red pennant flies erect from the light beige tower at center, while the heavy drapery of a sagging white banner in the foreground obscures much of the structures. Propped across two precariously slanting thin sticks, the banner overtakes the composition with sagging dark folds. Howard seems to have painted a literal white flag of defeated pictures across his tableau. Perhaps Banner dates from around the brief period following Howard's arrival to London, when the painter recalled being completely derailed in his painting. He blamed political theory. He also blamed his move to London. Howard wrote that he had first moved to London and he found that although he could still paint, it was suddenly impossible to make pictures, as he put it. He recalled that the problem derived from leaving New York, which had seemed, according to him, quote, a stimulating place, like a cocktail, end quote. Although Howard claimed that he could have continued painting in New York with joy and with ease, he said that it had been the simple accident of displacement that enabled him in this new existence to find far richer ore. In Howard's second chosen exile from San Francisco to London, he found new pictures that deepened his relationship with the European avant-garde. So Howard's arrival in London in 1933, as we heard briefly, coincided with the beginning of the brief life of Unit 1, which was a coalition of British artists and architects linked perhaps only by their varied rejections of the dominant naturalism of period English art. Even the name Unit 1 attempted to conjoin a sense of unified movement, unit, with a focus on individuality, one. So this group of 11 artists, who all consider themselves moderns, produced work that spanned diverse styles and media, ranging from, here, founder Paul Nash's surrealist landscapes, we've seen one of these already, and Nicholson's Abstraction, and from Moore's biomorphic sculpture to the reinforced concrete architecture of Colin Lucas. Here, a photograph of 1933's Hopsfield House. Informal meetings and the enthusiasm of the critic Reed, who edited and wrote the introduction for the group's 1934 book, linked these artists together extremely briefly during Howard's early years in London. Although the group quickly fell apart, Howard's desire to distance his work from the stylistic labels, I think, resonates with the aims of this group of fiercely independent modern artists. In 1935, Howard took over the execution of a mural designed by Unit 1's eldest associate, Edward Wadsworth, a former Vorticist leader who was working on the Deloire Pavilion, which was designed by Eric Mendelsohn and Serge Chemaeff at Bexel-on-the-Sea. And here I show you just a postcard to give you a sense of what that modernist architecture looked like. So the mural that Howard executed was based in part on Wadsworth's 1929 painting, Shells and Cones, which you see here on the left, and with the mural design on the right. And this painting, both these paintings, evidences the artist's post-World War I transition from a vorticism of chaotic technological forms to these marine still lifes. Wadsworth's mural design used stylized, recognizable shapes such as shells and starfish, an undulating sea chart, and numerous banners. Some of these things we've seen already circulating in Howard's work, and here he's executing this decorative scheme. Other scholars have read in Wadsworth's work these oceanic motifs as linked to Britain's identity as an island nation with imperial power. Although Howard only executed the design, 1935 begins to mark a decisive shift in his own work, as you can see in the show and in some of the images that we've seen so far. This is when he moves towards more geometric, abstracted compositions that often float in the center of the page without a horizon line, as Wadsworth's floated on the wall. So the focus on the ocean at Bexel might also register the ways English art of the period engaged in a new dialogue with the wider avant-garde world. As tensions mounted in Europe leading up to World War II, I'll show you examples of some famous artists who passed through London during Howard's early years here. I've tried to pick Bay Area examples of their work, so this might be familiar to some of you. So the Mayer Gallery, where Unit 1 exhibited, mounted solo shows of the work of Max Ernst, who I've already mentioned, in 1933. And in 1934, in London, they had exhibitions of Paul Klee and work by George Gross. During Howard's years in England, the country also became a refuge for avant-gardists associated with particular strains of modernism who fled the mainland of Europe. So in 1935, the French champion of purism, Amdi Ozafant, opened an academy in London. The Russian-born Naum Gabo moved in 1936 from Paris, where he'd been among the most famous of more than 400 artists associated with this loosely affiliated group called Abstract Creation. And the Dutch-born painter Piet Mondrian relocated to London in 1938. In addition to becoming home to these champions of abstraction's different styles, the London that Howard's working in also took part in global debates about international surrealism, which was becoming increasingly political as war broke out in Europe. For example, Howard exhibited in the 1936 International Surrealist Exhibition in London, which I show you an installation shot from here. And he also attended a meeting in winter of 1939 to 40 with leading English surrealists to discuss securing unity with André Breton's International Federation of Independent Revolutionary Art, whose program called for a proletarian revolution and a ban on participating with other groups and a requirement to only exhibit and publish as surrealists. So this unified movement failed to find sufficient signatories in England, but Howard was deeply invested and attended many meetings on this topic. In 1939, London Bulletin, a magazine that was published by the Surrealist group in England, published an admiring review of Howard's exhibition. In it, Russian poet George Reevy wrote an admiring prose about Howard's exhibition, including an illustration of this painting, Presage, from 1938. 4 months before the outbreak of World War II, Reevy linked the painting's forms to, as he put it, a relentlessly mobile architecture, a world in dissolution and remaking, a sort of animated jigsaw puzzle, the liberated parts of which are struggling to form a new organic unity of their own. Here, in contrast to the static qualities that had defined Howard's earlier work, talked about things like sort of pinned down, compositional elements, they seem to flex and assemble. Neutral colors replace the earlier blue sky and brown landscape to create an increasingly ambiguous emptiness. Tall vertical forms nearly span the right side of Howard's paper. Orange and blue masses rest on and under attenuated blue and gray legs, which seem to lean on or stand in a rectangular brown formation that creates a kind of architectural corner. On the right, thin washes of yellow overlap beige and black shapes, passing behind and over, interrupted by strained hair-like lines that conjoin forms across the paper. Reevy mused that the painter's vision momentarily arrested these shapes in order to show, quote, the stress and strain of some sort of revolution going on, end quote. Even without human figures, Howard's crowded composition evokes a dramatic puzzle inflected by contemporary global politics. The Howards left England for San Francisco in early July 1940, after German forces had taken over Paris. A period of Howard's life you'll hear more about soon in the talk that follows. Here in San Francisco, Howard participated in the war effort, completing a design for an unrealized tapestry that was similar in design to Abstraction in Flight, an extant painting that I show you here. That unfinished work was intended for the lounge of the Officers' Recreation Building in the Alameda Naval Air Station. He also designed posters for the Office of War Information in the 1940s. I'd like to end today with one of my favorite of Howard's paintings, created during World War II. Prescience, which won a Purchase Prize at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's 1942 Artists for Victory exhibition. The painting links formally with First War Winter, made on Howard's arrival back to San Francisco, which I'm showing you a smaller version of here on the left, obviously. Offering another red form in the center, this one larger, undulating, and bisected by thick black lines. Prescience is a brighter painting than First War Winter, but one with, I think, a more ambiguous space. It doesn't have the same strong horizontal forms of that earlier painting. A small spot of bright blue in the upper center of the image appears to be held in place by curling lines, which do not obey a geometric logic but meander or dangle like hairs, ligaments, or irregular wires. Howard layers planes in which, as in the off-white area on the right, floating forms oscillate like apertures, cut through the surface to provide a look at a distant horizon. Although the meaning of this painting remained ambiguous to contemporary viewers, it suggested wartime victory over Adolf Hitler's regime, which had attacked abstraction and surrealism in Degenerate Art, an exhibition staged in Munich in 1937. The very ambiguity of this painting forced viewers, and I think forces us too, to think for ourselves, encouraging the development of discerning vision and skepticism that would allow individuals in the 40s and maybe in the present to resist propaganda and despotism. In 1942, Howard's notion of painting as a means beyond language for common communication between individuals, a kind of psychologized abstraction that roamed between organic and geometric, it possessed a democratic and also anti-fascist potential. Created in the middle of World War II, Howard's painting underscores the complex, productive space between abstraction and surrealism, allowing us, I hope, to envision new connections between the stylistic wings that we know, and also to see Howard's own movement between period styles, not as an equivocation, but as a deliberate aesthetic position of an intermediate genius. Thank you.
Okay, our last speaker, thank you, Lauren. Our last speaker today is Jeff Gunderson, who's been the librarian and archivist at the San Francisco Art Institute's Anne Bremer Memorial Library since 1981. Jeff is the author of the title essay for a book called The Moment of Seeing, Minor White in the California School of Fine Arts, published by Chronicle Books in 2006. And also the author of a piece called A Combination of Accidents, the San Francisco Art Scene in the 1940s, published in a book called The San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, 75 Years of Looking Forward in 2010, which incidentally won the Art Librarian Society Worldwide Books Award for that same year. Jeff's introductory essay to a book called Black Power, Flower Power, photographs by Perkle Jones and Ruth Marian Baruch was published in September 2012 by the Perkle Jones Trust. This past spring, Jeff did a presentation in conjunction with the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art's Diebenkorn Matisse exhibition called Meeting of the Minds, a series on the artists Joan Brown and Elmer Bischoff. He is currently working on a collection of essays about open water swimming. Please welcome Jeff Gunderson.
All right, let's see if I can fumble through this. I swore I would tell a knock-knock joke at this point, but I don't know if I have an appropriate one. Let's see here. Ian, where are you?
This is your PowerPoint.
No.
Okay.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Apsara. And thank you for doing this show. Wow, it's really dynamic. It's terrific. So I'm thrilled to be here. This is sort of kaleidoscopic, and it's chronological, and it's narrative, and it's a little travel log. In 1940, Charles Howard and Madge Knight, they didn't fly on this plane, but in 1940, Charles Howard and Madge Knight returned to San Francisco to find 2 new bridges and a World's Fair. The world had indeed changed. When Howard had left for England, Coit Tower had just been completed. His brother Henry was one of its architects. And his brother John Langley Howard was one of the artists of the controversial murals. This one is Lang's California industrial scene, with the striking workers on the left. Striking meaning striking, and striking meaning striking. And this is a very nice detail in Bernard Zackheim's Coit Tower mural showing Charles's brother John Langley grabbing a Karl Marx book. As a librarian, this is my obligatory library scene required in any presentation. So Charles Howard missed out on this very public squabble about contemporary art in San Francisco, as well as missing out on the San Francisco General Strike in 1934, the Depression years in California. They arrive in time for the closing months of the Golden Gate International Exposition in the middle of San Francisco Bay on Treasure Island. And they're encouraged to hurry. Treasure Island closes forever, September 29th. At the fair, Diego Rivera is painting his mural destined for City College of San Francisco titled Pan American Unity. And Frida is there in her surrealist splendor. And all of this takes place in this really dynamic exhibition show that really, I think, is orchestrated by the architect Timothy Pfluger in an installation called Art in Action, so people could watch the artists under the microscope at the GGIE. Howard returns to find a thriving San Francisco Museum of Art, now the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, in their new building at Van Ness and McAllister. Their museum director is Grace McCann Morley. And she wanted to make sure the museum stayed close to the growing edge of creative art. She did this by mixing a great assortment of wonderful local artists who she had this great respect for with international shows. Photography with Ansel Adams and Edward Weston, and Peter Stackpole. She initiating a film program, keeping the museum open until 10 p.m., incorporating music, and doing up to 100 shows a year, which really puts pressure on everybody working at the museum here, with a staff of a handful probably. I think she had the artists doing it themselves. Artists shown in the 1930s, the ones that Howard missed, included Gauguin, Cézanne, Matisse, Gorky, as well as exhibitions that traveled from the New York Museum of Modern Art, like Cubism and Abstract Art, and in August of 1937, Fantastic Art, Dada, and Surrealism. Picasso's Guernica was displayed publicly for the very first time anywhere at the museum in San Francisco in August and September 1939. Now, it dawned on me that this is exactly when World War II starts in Europe, and this is the painting that's at the museum that people are peeking at. The following summer, 1940, the Picasso retrospective that the New York Museum of Modern Art mounted comes to San Francisco and includes Guernica again. San Franciscans staged a sit-down strike on the last day of the show on July 22nd, 1940, refusing to leave the galleries at the 10 p.m. closing because they wanted to keep looking at this. This event coincides with Madge Knight and Charles Howard's return to California that very month. Howard wasn't the only expat artist returning, as evidenced from this article in one of the San Francisco newspapers exclaiming that, with the darkness over Europe, San Francisco may well inherit the ancient mantle of Paris as the world's new center of arts and letters. The article mentions the esteemed painter and printmaker Stanley Hayter, who's pictured here, and his wife, the San Francisco sculptress Helen Phillips, have relocated to Frisco, where Hayter will be teaching his new and slightly revolutionary techniques to the students at the California School of Fine Arts. Hayter and Phillips arrive in California in June of 1940, a month before Charles Howard and Madge Knight. These four artists were important elements in bridging that European and Northern California art that Grace McCann Morley was so interested in cultivating. Within months, both Hayter and Howard were showing work at Grace Morley's San Francisco Museum of Art. Howard and Madge Knight moved into a place on Water Street, just off Columbus in North Beach. It's a terrific block if you know it at all. It's right by the San Remo Hotel, right off of Francisco. It's right around the corner from brother Robert Howard and sister-in-law Adeline Kent's studio, both noted sculptors, where they all would hang out. And in the upper right in this photograph, you see Charles Howard's hieroglyph, which is terrific. I wandered down there the other day from the school and knocked on the door, and architects have managed to do their best to ruin it, and they treated me like I had Ebola when I walked in to take a look at it. I said, hey, this is a famous place, and the fireplaces are still there, which is very cool to see, I gotta admit. It's very interesting. It's, this is on Francisco. On Francisco between, what is the cable car street? Between Powell, I think, there, and the... Thank you very much. A wonderful spot in the world, as is Water Street, and it must back up to Water Street, I assume. And how it looks in color. They would also wander a couple of blocks up Francisco Street to the corner of Leavenworth, where Bob and Addie's house was located. Another famous residence, which needs a plaque in front of it, because not only because of Bob Howard and Adeline Kent, but all the artists that happened through there. Artists would stay there from the California School of Fine Arts when they were visiting, as the Howards were either in Kentfield or staying someplace else, and Mark Rothko lived there for 2 separate summers. Those 2 summers were where his work is maturing. Within a few months of arriving, Charles Howard displays First War Winter at the San Francisco Art Association Annual of 1940, which wins the museum's purchase prize. Art Digest in New York features Howard's painting with this great quote: "Across the continent, in San Francisco, the more radical phases of aesthetic experience maintain their hold. Until stronger competition comes, San Francisco may well be called the capital of ultramodern art in America." So they'd surrendered. You know, New York had put up the white flag, and it was San Francisco at the time. Another fellow art traveler of Howard's was Clay Spoon, who I mispronounce always, but I'll call him Spoon for the moment. Clay Spoon, shown here teaching at the San Francisco Art Institute, California School of Fine Arts, with his student Jeremy Anderson. Howard encouraged Spoon's set of watercolors for a 1942 exhibition at the museum titled Fantastic War Machines. And I'm afraid Ronald Reagan may have seen these at some point, because this is essentially Star Wars that he conjures up, 40 years later. But these terrific surreal paintings that were just unbelievable. Essentially satirizing the military in some respects, I think. Douglas McKagy was a key ingredient to the art world of San Francisco in the 40s. First as Grace McCann Morley's assistant at the museum, and then as the director of the California School of Fine Arts. It was a wonderful circle of artists and friends that included McKagy and his wife Germaine, who was the acting curator at the Legion of Honor, the Howard brothers and in-laws, Hayter, Dor Bothwell, Clay Spoon, Helen Phillips, and many others. McKagy orchestrated the museum's Sawdust and Spangles exhibition in 1942, where under the big top were acrobats, Jojo the Clown, and performing seals. Artists included Bob Howard, Addie Kent, Clay Spoon, David Park, and this poster done by Charles Howard and Madge Knight. Somehow this was to relieve the tension and distract San Franciscans from a world at war. McKagy's intentions were to transform museums from mausoleums to happenings. And yet, the war was everywhere, as illustrated in the cover of the 1943 San Francisco Art Association Annual of Drawings and Prints, with Minnie Okubo's on-watch drawing sent in from the Topaz relocation camp for Japanese Americans. McKagy loved that circus show, I think, and I just stumbled upon this recently because this is McKagy in Dallas. He becomes head of the Dallas Museum of Art, and he replicates this show in 1962, where he's director, and here he is as ringmaster. And it looks like he's smoking a cigarette, which I don't think he is. There's something in the background. But I look at these, you look at these kids, and you think, yeah, he's smoking a cigarette, but he looks kind of sinister and demented in a way. But I think McKagy is somebody to be reckoned with in the art world. In 1943, Sidney Janis and Grace Morley organized abstract and surrealist art in America, which included European emigre artists, as well as some of the first work seen in California of Mark Rothko, Jackson Pollock, Robert Motherwell, and showed Howard's first war winter again. McCagey and Charles Howard were true friends, as illustrated in this marvelous set of drawings that you can go see downstairs here, that Howard sent to McCagey on a daily basis when McCagey was in the Alum Rock Sanatorium in San Jose with TB. And this one is the first one I think he sends, called To the Absent Friend. And so you get another, it's wonderful to see his true drawings of things, and these are daily sketches that he's doing. Other artist friends included avant-garde filmmakers like the poet James Broughton, whose surrealist films that he did with Sidney Peterson were shown at the museum, The Potted Psalm, and that aesthetic from The Potted Psalm. Howard's painting Bivouac from 1940 is owned by Broughton, and Broughton would then often visit Howard and Madge Knight after their return to England. Ah, those surrealist avant-garde filmmakers. I mean, that had to be fun. In February of 45, Howard does the cover for Fortune magazine, symbolizing the controlled and planned manipulation of natural resources and the process of nature. This is the environment of a mid-1940s San Francisco art world where Grace Morley is pulling off a string of pioneering solo shows in the mid-40s of Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, and Robert Motherwell. The San Francisco Art Association Bulletin, shown here, was the local vehicle for art and artist news. The March issue featured Howard's article, What Concerns Me, which a month earlier had appeared in the Magazine of Art. Howard describes his laborious method of working. It is not a frisky business. It is drudgery. I look more than I paint, and I struggle with the paint and with myself. And this is reprinted in the catalog. And I'm not sure this is entirely true in a lot of ways, what he says. And they reprint the hieroglyph. And it certainly is work that he's doing, and certainly not a frisky business, and maybe a lot of personal wrestling that he is doing as well, but I really don't think the drudgery part is right. I find that hard to believe, so I'd be curious what people thought. Germaine McCagey, Douglas's co-conspirator, curator, and wife, shown here on the right, with Mrs. DeMenil from Houston, organized Charles Howard's retrospective exhibition at the Legion of Honor. The show takes place from May to June 1946, just when Charles and Madge are preparing to leave California. The color version of that. It's nice to have color reproductions. In those days, you had to suffer through black and white and everything. The Chain of Circumstance from 1946 that graces the cover of the small catalog for that retrospective. The bulletin mentions Howard's show at the Legion of Honor and their departure to England, where they will try to track down many of their pictures left there during the war. It sounds like from these previous presentations, a lot of these things just were never found. They're out there somewhere, but who knows? This retrospective of Howard's travels to New York City, where Art Digest describes Howard as at the forefront of the American abstract stream, and how his artist's sense never misses. That's a pretty good review. After his departure from San Francisco, McCagey writes of Howard in Circle magazine in the summer of 1948 with the title A Margin of Chaos. McCagey's article reproduced Howard's The First Hypothesis. Howard's influence, along with an abstract and surrealist thread that continued to impact Bay Area art and the California School of Fine Arts, as noted in this clipping, showing a wild-eyed Stanley Hayter up there in the upper right, and he's with the painter Harlan Jackson, actually, who was a student at the time. Clay Spohn down there in the bottom left. The photographer Minor White, who's up in the other corner with Ansel Adams. And then Douglas McKagy, who's pretending to be interested in a piece of ceramic sculpture in the lower left there. McKagy organized in 1949 the Western Roundtable on Modern Art to wrestle with these ideas of post-World War II avant-garde, you know, all those students who had come on that GI Bill, the Holocaust, the two world wars and most of their lives, and the atom bomb. Panelists include the anthropologist Gregory Bateson, the composer Darius Milhaud, the rhetorician Kenneth Burke, Mark Tobey, and Marcel Duchamp, shown here on the left, and their conservative foil, Frank Lloyd Wright. The surrealist, Dadaesque vein is evident in the title of this costume carnival held at the California School of Fine Arts in 1949, and it was titled The Unknown, and that title was dreamed up by, it wasn't just a flip title dreamed up by, you know, a group of the auxiliary. It was really dreamed up by Clay Spohn and Mark Rothko. And in hearing other people today, I think of that chaos and that unknown that everybody was trying to grapple with. What's great about this poster, though, is this part at the bottom where it says supper, bar, distractions, and dancing. And unfortunately, the distractions aren't as documented as well as they should be. But there is one distraction that is documented, and it's Clay Spohn's Museum of Little Known and Unknown Objects, which was held in its Studio 13. And it spawns a whole generation of beatnik and funk art of the 1950s. And you realize he truly is the granddaddy of these found objects, ephemeral, you know, sort of rat bastard society things that wind up 10 years later. The party was riddled with surrealist and avant-garde imagery. And I think when people showed up without a costumes, the students made costumes for them so that they would blend in. In the January 1951 Art Association Bulletin, Charles Howard writes from England of his amazement that there is so little art from the US shown in London. He thinks it would be a, quote, first-class opportunity to demonstrate that there is more to America than ill-tempered soldiers and gold-plated bathrooms. And he finishes with, do please give our warmest regards to any who remember us. Sincerely, Charles Howard. At that point in 1951, plenty of people remembered Charles Howard. And now, thanks to this wonderful exhibition here at the Berkeley Art Museum, Howard will not be forgotten. Thank you.
Okay, I would now invite all of our panelists, all of our speakers to come up to the front. We'll have the lights on, and as promised, we will take questions from all of you and perhaps discuss a little bit among each of us too. So are there any questions from the audience? Peter? Are we going to be passing a microphone around? Yes, so there's an extra right over there. I can stand over here. Okay. Well, I'll ask a question to open up, and this is to everyone. I mean, the experience, and then I'll come sit over there next to Douglas. I think the experience with the Giorgione, that's so fascinating to me. As Apsara said, it's an epiphany. And, you know, I guess one question would be, can one think of other moments in the careers or of other artists that are similar? And if so, can we even think of Howard's experience as part of a broader type of experience wherein an artist, or really anyone, frankly, undergoes this momentous, life-changing transformation. In his case, in front of a work of art, but it could be in front of anything, really. But I'm going to stop there and ask that very question to all of you.
Jump right in.
Should I go for? Oh, yeah, okay. I think of, okay, now being a regionalist, provincial, local person in a cosmopolitan city, I think of David Park's Bay Area figure, his paintings, Kids on Bikes, and the Studio 13 Jazz Band, when people like Hassel Smith and Devencourt and others thought, what the hell has David gone mad, when they first saw that, him rejecting abstract expressionism and then them gravitating to that same thing.
It's a complicated question because the epiphany any epiphany is tempered by what happens afterwards. There's probably this initial kind of response. So Helen Frankenthaler graduated from Bennington in 1948. The first person that she befriends, as her date is Clement Greenberg. Greenberg takes her to see Pollock's show at Betty Parsons in the early 50s, and she described that as a fairly watershed moment where they got into the gallery and he said, okay, hang out here with the paintings, I'm going to go talk with Betty. And she felt like she was, in an ocean and just completely overwhelmed and stimulated and elated, but there was that moment of what was possible in terms of what she could be at a point.
Well, I think also what's interesting here is that, he's writing about it after the fact and citing that as the epiphany, when we know from that letter that he was already exploring these ideas and making watercolors. And he sent that letter from Paris, or from France, which was right before he went to Italy. So he's already sort of decided he wants to become a painter or an artist, but in reflection, many years later, in 46, he writes about that as being the moment of epiphany. So it becomes this really, and he obviously had a very strong connection to Giorgione for citing that and calling that to our attention. So it's also about creating the narrative himself about his own artistic awakening, which I think is really interesting in that sense.
I mean, I think it's such an interesting story because it is so bodily and so negative. He talks about running out of the church. He looks for 15 minutes, runs out of the church, throws up, then decides he's got to go back to France. So for me, it's sort of whoa, and then he decided he wanted to be a painter out of that. It's a very bodily, visceral, seemingly on the surface negative. He doesn't talk about, and then I went back to figure out how it had evoked this, or the things that you would think from an art historical standpoint. One would try to understand the reaction or something, but that's not it. It's sort of an overwhelming bodily experience of it that I haven't read a lot of other places. Yeah.
Do you want to ask about this particular issue? Okay, just very briefly. Ruskin, when he first saw Tintoretto's paintings in Venice, it was a stunning experience for him, basically similar to what happened with Howard, and Ruskin became very ill, incapacitated for a long time even. But that was to the good. Yeah, so I would disagree that this was a bad experience. I would say it's like Helen Frankenthaler became, if you like seasick or nauseous or something. I mean, the experience of coming into contact with Pollock's work was, it just messes you up. It messes up your world, who you think you were. To undergo such a momentous transformation. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think those are really interesting examples, and the Tintoretto gives us sort of a multiple points, because what I find difficult to like understand and believe from Howard's story is that like Tintoretto has those really like confusing sight lines, and the perspectives are weird. Like that's sort of the thing that he's known for, is this disorienting space. And Pollock too, like whereas with Giorgione, there's like a way it locks into space, and that seems to be part of what he's interested in. And he does talk about it in kind of like art historical terms as becoming then a synthesis. So it doesn't seem, maybe he just doesn't describe it enough to describe what about it was overwhelming.
Yeah,
but it's kind of, it has these different
I think there's
different
something to
senses.
that. Yeah, you feel like this was this incredible experience, and then you read his explanation of it, and it seems like pat art history 101, that the thing that made him physically ill was to see the draftsmanship of Florence combined with the colorism of Venice. Like, that doesn't cut it. So maybe that goes a little bit to Apsara's point that this is written in retrospect, and he's kind of tamping down or taming whatever it was. I did think when we saw Sather Tower and then the mother's watercolor that was hiding behind Florence and Venice is the father and the mother, and that it's about coming of age, and like you want to throw up. He doesn't actually, we don't know if he threw up. I just want to say, like, that's the empiricist in me. Like, we'll never know. He was ill in some way, but maybe he was sick because he was some synthesis of mother and father, i.e. grow, and then feeling your calling, and your calling in relation to your parents, but also your own life, which is an incredible burden and obligation and path and pleasure all at the same time. I love
And terrifying.
and totally terrifying.
Know how to
I'm an
paint at
adult.
that point.
I'm alone. I just graduated from college, and yeah, I'm bumming around Europe, and then all of a sudden, and this whole description on page 57, I invite you to read it. It's just almost like, has the quality of like a creepy story, which I mean in a good way. Like there's this town between Venice and Milan, and in this town, I walk down this straight path. It's like Pilgrim's Progress. It's very allegorical.
But
And then there was no one in the church, and this one man was there, and he pulled the curtain across, the banner across, and and showed me this painting. And it's again, I'm saying this all in the most positive way. Would that all of us are so fortunate as to experience such a moment in some little town between Venice and Milan. Where we stop sort of bumming around Europe, so to speak, and suddenly have our energies concentrated in some kind of almost nauseating some way whose intensity makes us physically ill because it changes our world.
I also just want to draw attention to, the dramatic effect that he brings to that too, because, later on he refers to himself as a dramatizing agent, and so he's creating these very dramatic compositions that are backlit, almost like stage settings, and McCagey writes about this too, in saying that there's a kind of drama of the mind that happens in his work. So he's also like creating this incredible sense of drama behind experiencing this painting.
Yeah, which I detect in what you're saying. Of course, you love the artist, so it's not critical, but you're calling our attention to the kind of dramatic or theatrical or constructed nature of how he chooses to portray this. Whereas I'm always a more naive, credulous human being, and I just think, of course he invents it and he has his agenda and it's later in his life. I mean, but he's being very genuine. He's not just sort of inventing himself or what matters to him. So yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
It could have been just something he ate.
Yeah, well, let me turn on that question or that hypothesis and ask, or just point out that there are a lot of words like intermediate, suspended, frozen, and then Douglas was talking about kind of bipolar. Actually, there's a contested nature to whatever is this intermediate state that his work portrays. The Giorgione it's frozen, but I would say it's more like everything is in this kind of breathless, suspended quality or moment. And does anyone want to try to put a finer point on what is the nature of the frozen or suspended or intermediate quality one finds in Howard's work, and what's at stake for him in choosing to always be in that neither here nor there zone?
McCagey describes that zone as the margin of chaos in his essay. So I think that's really interesting, where things are like on the brink of collapse. And of course, he's working between the wars and during the war, Second World War. So I think there is this moment of some sort of event, or maybe it's destruction. We don't really know that he's showing you that space before it happens, where everything is controlled. So I think that.
Yeah. I mean, that reminds me of the moment in Lauren's talk when she was mentioning about the crumpled forms, vertical forms, and the idea of global crisis, and also Douglas pointing out the late black. It reminds me of Caravaggio's late blacks, which are, as Michael Fried, the art historian, says, no longer even chiaroscuro. It's some other denser, more existential black. In any case, though, the question is, and this is for all of us too, is do we have our personal drama on the one hand, our Castelfranco altarpiece, and then we have, world events and cataclysms, and they're finally just two separate things altogether, and then sometimes they're combined in our works of art or in our sentences or our daily life? Or can they be, what I wondered about is that, as I think you said, Douglas, like everything for him is personal. It's always about him. And that seems like very narcissistic and uninterested in world events and so on. But I guess I wonder about the personal being the necessary way that we experience the political. And I just mean like, if there's a photograph of a dead child on a beach, or North Korea fires a missile over Japan, like in some way our route, our portal, our way to actually take that on board is through something just very private, very and that's what's being registered in these works. It's not he's like referring to events like a journalist would, and then he's got his private space over here. No, it's always about him, including how we register or how he registers disaster.
I think where it gets interesting, personal, private versus public, is that, he moves into some more archetypal vectors of experience. So the forms, while they're entirely personal and kind of from his own psyche, also have this. He moves from Freud to Jung, basically, which is a far more poetic, more amorphic. The portal is far more open. It's not just about eros and sexuality, but there's also this relationship. So it's the tension in the pictures that intrigues me. So the bipolar versus the tripartite trinity format. We can look at the pictures formally. They're interesting. They're sophisticated. But in each picture, there's this built-in tension that may never be resolved, but I think on some level it's about who he was, or who he wanted to be, or who he thought he was. And so I just want to get back. one more time to Giorgione just to say it's impossible to separate the formal qualities of that triangular stability from the identity of the people in the picture. You've got two men and one woman. And therein lies another level of interpretation, however you want to read it. But there it is. It's that triad, and it's also very much based on identity and gender.
Yeah, well, so Douglas has just said that that's the last word on Giorgione, but I'm saving my really killer Giorgione question, so maybe we'll come back to him. But let's, yes, right here. Yeah, Yetchen, hi. Wait for the, here it comes, the mic, yeah.
Thanks for giving these great talks. I did not know this artist prior, so this is always good to learn more things. I guess the question is directed still about Giorgione, but it's for Apsara and Douglas. I think when I looked at the Giorgione, one thing that I thought was very striking is you've talked about horizons and how horizons are typically things in landscapes that tell you between the earth and the sky. But in the Giorgione, it seemed to me that the horizon there was the line between this nominal kind of outside, the landscape, and then the parquet floor of the interior. So that seems like a sacred space to me where you've got a grounded physical experience and you have this kind of intellectual, spiritual experience. And so the disappearance of that in Howard's paintings, I just want to hear more about that and how what you think of the portals, the openings or apertures, and how those relate to kind of traveling in paintings as being a kind of intellectual, psychic exercise where you're moving through space, but it's not physical space, and yet you're still embodied in front of a physical object.
Yeah, well, I would also just point out that I think there's probably, you could deduce maybe 3 horizon lines in that Giorgione painting, because you have, the interior horizon, but then you have this imaginary horizon line that divides the composition and then opens it up into, the exterior world. But then off in the distance, you have another horizon line receding into space. And so in the Sacra Conversazione genre, it's about creating this dialogue with the divine and creating this interior space that is so much about spirituality and thinking, and but then they're also gesturing to the much larger world outside. Is when you go out of the cathedral or the altar, that's what you're going to encounter. So it's bringing together the sort of life experience with this interior kind of reflection, space of reflection. So I think that also is a kind of analog or analogy for the painter too, in a certain sense. That makes sense.
So it does make sense. My take on the horizon line versus no horizon line moves you from the terrestrial. The horizon line tethers you to things that we know about our world, right? I mean, and your eye kind of naturally sees it as a kind of landscape horizon. When that vanishes, it becomes oceanic space, it becomes cosmological space, and it becomes a space that suddenly you're untethered from anything that would ground you, literally. It's a much more poetic space, which is why so many of the abstract expressionists sought out that space, because it enabled them to make art that function in the 4th dimension, or 6th dimension, or wherever.
So there's a question right here.
I was interested that you discussed the flags and the idea that the flag marked a place. That was really helpful. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas about the hairs that are always kind of thin and black, and that they do have any ideas you could share about those.
You want a Freudian interpretation or a Jungian? I mean, the hair's very interesting. I mean, and it's not hair. We're not talking about hair. We're talking about something that has the whimsical nature and
The black lines.
organicism of hair, right? Louise Bourgeois, her drawings are full of that. And she had very long hair, you know, at a certain point. But the 50s drawings are interesting in the same kind of way. So for me, it's about whimsy. It's about eccentricity. It's about the antithesis of an architectural line. It's an organic line. It's a line that can meander. It's a line that has no definition per se, but takes you on a journey to a place that you didn't expect to go. So tucked into an image, it violates, the order of the image.
I guess I would just add to that it's also ambiguously, mechanical wires that could be, the wires of the telephone pole that are, a sign of modernization and industrialization, but it's also organic at the same time because it could refer to the eyelashes and these tendrils. So it plays these two functions as well.
I'll just say briefly, I think the drawings for Douglas McCagy are, there it really is hair, and it's incredible hair. I can't think of better hair that I've seen in works of art. It's charismatic hair. You want to look at it, and part of it is because it's so intimate. It's pubic hair as well as hair on top of the head, and it's connected with daily life, literally, because he sent a drawing every day, as we've heard. I'm not sure what that's about, but those pictures are so disarmingly personal and intense and physical. And for me, that's what his portrayal of hair is about, is some way of giving us our creaturely existence that most art, of course, is too polite or is otherwise preoccupied to show.
Thanks, Alex. That helped me think about part of what I think is interesting about the hairs is that they, or if we're going to call them that, or I've thought of them as wires too, because they make you think about like the sense of touch, and like so much of the work, as you pointed out, is sort of like cosmological or oceanic. It seems dematerialized in certain ways, like it's plays of light, or whereas those filaments, you kind of want to figure out, is it string? Are they going to be soft? Are they going to be hard to the touch? Are they holding everything up? Or are they kind of pulling everything down? So I think they're another one of those points of tension in the canvas that becomes a kind of textural point of tension too.
Right here.
Thank you. Could you say a little bit about his relationship to Calder? Because I always associated Howard's work a lot to Calder's work. It's almost like he's formalizing the movement of Calder's sculpture. Just wanted to know a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, they were close friends. They were lifelong friends. I came across a reference, which I hope to be true, that they briefly shared a studio together in New York in 1926 before Calder moved to Paris, which, of course, Howard had just come from. So they were friends. They exchanged each other's works. One of the paintings in the exhibition is actually a painting that comes from the Calder family and has remained on view in their private residence and has never been moved since. And it's a very circus-like composition too, so it relates to Calder's work sort of wonderfully. And then in many of his compositions, you see there's a sense of movement, and I think movement was really important to Howard. And of course, Robert Howard, his brother, was also a sculptor, and Adeline Kent, and of course, Calder is known for incorporating movement into sculptural form. So it's a kind of implied sense of movement because, of course, he shows it frozen in space and time. So. But then, of course, that painting that I showed also links them together at, the Whitney Studio Club and as being jolly old friends.
I think, at the richest level, your nice question just makes me think again, per Apsara's comments about the word suspension or suspense versus frozen, I would say. I mean, it strikes me that Calder, even in the watercolor, showing the Howard brothers twirling around, is interested in fluid or mobile states, and that he's doing that not as a matter of artistic style or something like that, but because there's an ethics to that, to the idea that the world sometimes beautifully suspends, time stands still, or doesn't stand still, it opens out, and we're not all fated to just live in linear, rational, timed coordinates, that there's this other part of being alive. In the back, yes?
First, thank you to Douglas. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and spent a lot of time at the Albright-Knox Gallery with those paintings in my formative years. So, and I dragged the family there all the time, so they still remember to this day. I was thinking about these lines. In formless space, there are no lines. The first form is perhaps a dot, and the first form and movement is perhaps a line. For what that's worth, it doesn't have to. Just making it into something drives me a little nuts sometimes, like creating.
So what you've just described is a Euclidean point-to-point direct hit, right? But Howard's lines are not always that way. They can be. I mean, it depends on the image, but his lines are much more quirky and idiosyncratic, and so it's the humanity that goes into making that kind of line, right? Where it's not point to point, but it's whimsical.
Well, that's a construct we've laid upon those forms, is that rectilinearism. Nobody said it has to be straight lines.
Right. But also, in a sense, it's free form.
Yeah.
So there's no definition whatsoever about that. All right. I mean, it does define something, negative and positive space, but dimensionally it doesn't. If you know what I mean, it's not. Doesn't declare itself in the way that some kind of geometric form would.
Yeah, and that's
it's really very free.
And that's
freer,
internal,
freer.
External, kind of thing. Perhaps it's the horizon line in a emotional or psychological, unconscious kind of sense. I don't know. Yeah. But I wanted to ask Lauren something, because you said something that struck me, that this wrestling. You showed the painting, I think it was post-war, I don't remember the title, but you said that being able to, you used the word discernment, I think, that the mental process of discerning this work would perhaps allow analogously for people to wrestle with anti-fascism or fascism. And it makes me wonder, well, who was the audience doing this? I don't see the correlation. I mean, I can understand it, but who would have been looking at Howard's works? How widespread were they? Artists, politicians, academics?
So that's a work, the one that you're talking about is Prescience, and it wins one of the Purchase Prizes at the Met Museum. The Metropolitan Museum of Art puts on a show called Artists for Victory, and there's an Artists for Victory association of artists that are trying to figure out how they can contribute to the war effort. And so they're John Stewart Curry, who I also write about, won the first place prize for this Midwestern landscape. So it's interesting to me to think about how those two could be ways of speaking towards victory. And this probably goes back to Alex's question too, about whether it's an issue of the deeply personal and the entirely personal, or whether we might think about these things more broadly. And for me, especially in the 40s, they're kind of the same. Like the idea that you could have a personal experience meant that you lived in a democracy, at least as formulated by people living in democracies who were trying to think about what was wrong with fascism. So I think Howard's work at the Met was seen as it would be by people at the Met today. So like, it's a fairly not huge, wide demographic, but this is really how a lot of people in the art world are thinking about the power of abstraction when you're trying to think about what abstraction can do for democracy, which in 1942, everybody's trying to figure out, like, what can we do for democracy? And abstract painters aren't saying, well, we should stop being abstract painters. They're saying, actually, we educate people's eyes to think about this ambiguous space, to think about what would it mean to be frozen between, what would it mean to not be a symbol of anything. So I think the idea of what abstraction could do against something like social realism was this really fertile territory in this moment, trying to teach people to see. It shows up a lot in art criticism and art history of that period, because the idea was then if you had this kind of trained vision, you wouldn't be susceptible to propaganda. So that the idea was if you could kind of educate your eye well enough, and part of that education is through looking at abstraction, looking at these ambiguous images, trying to find the words, trying to think through, are these hairs, what are these? If you could think about how uncertain vision could be, then you would be less likely to be duped by a dictator. So that's I am sympathetic to that philosophy. I'm not sure if it resonates widely, but that's a lot of the rhetoric of the 40s.
To me, whenever I see those little phalanges or dangling things, it seems like loose ends. That's what keeps coming up for me. They're loose ends. Most of the time, they're not connecting to anything. At first, I was thinking it's electrical wires in an architectural space that haven't been yet connected, but just loose ends. And it makes me feel uncomfortable. I'm just watching my reaction. It's uncomfortable. You know, a lot of the work of realism and surrealism, rather, in general, is unsettling. I'm wondering, but he always seems to be in this sort of unsettled state in all of his works. Or is he trying to find a comfort within that discomfort? Or is he making a statement about the political situation and how the world is in between the wars? Or having us think about, just trying to make a viewer like me unsettled and think about. Kind of a lot of questions there, but
Sure. I think Alex said something really interesting about those drawings in relationship to the lines in the paintings. And I think, you know, as an artist and as a painter, they, you know, I'd love to, unfortunately Bruce McGaw already left, who's been painting for 60-some years. But it'd be interesting to ask them about putting lines in drawings. And I think maybe people, you know, painters will gravitate to drawings. I mean, that's in their psyche. They're going to do that with meaningful things or subliminal things, perhaps. And boy, they are so amazingly interesting and curious in these paintings. They're more understandable in the drawings of McCaughey, of course, but within the paintings, they do hark to that chaos and that unknown in a lot of ways. And I like the fact that, you know, people will embrace that and look at it. When you mentioned the audience, I think, and I wish somebody would do some sort of study to see who went to these museums, especially the Museum of Art in San Francisco, because I think it probably was a broader audience than it is today. And I think they were more open-minded, believe it or not, than people are today. And they did have the patience to look at some of these things, just like they did looking at Picasso in 1939, 1940 at the museum.
I think my answer to your question would just be yes. I think it's all those things, and I think you do a really good job of laying out all the possibilities, that they are loose ends that might make us think about why they're not connecting, or make us see why sometimes they are connecting, that they're the personal, they're also the world that we live in, that they're all those things.
Yeah, I would just say I think loose ends is a great metaphor, and something that is incomplete. Works of art do not present everything tied up and neatly tied off, or only the bad works of art do. And it's, it speaks to what we spoke of before, the artist's quest or questioning. But I would just say, an artist making a work is very calm, is not at loose ends, that there's a need to be in an absolute, an athlete would call it a zone, just some space where you're making your work. And I agree, it's not probably not a drudgery totally, but in that space of calm, the eye of the storm is how you can articulate things that are perhaps profoundly unsettling. Jackson Pollock was never more lucid, never more calm and composed than when he was making his paintings. It's just a fact. It's when he was not making his paintings that he had trouble with life, not in the paintings. And the paintings, in a way, are loose ends too, but you need to be calm to get at something that profound. There was a question over here, yes.
Back to Giorgione and the damn line. Oh. Back to Giorgione and the lines. I think of abstraction in the 20th century as this incredible liberation from Renaissance perspective. And when I take a look at the Giorgione, one of the key things that I see are the parquet floor lines going at it. And so, I would just pose that even those lines that are everywhere are sort of symbolic of maybe a break of this liberation from Renaissance perspectival space, I mean, among all the other associations, which I think are just wonderful that everybody's brought out here. And that would then lead to the chaotic and the open-minded nature of what abstraction was manifesting for people in the 20th century. So I just throw that in there. Any thoughts on that?
We agree.
Well, that to me is again part of, like you're saying, part of the experience is not only I love this painting, but I realize I have to go beyond it, that I'm not going to make perspectival diagrams of parquet floors, and that's, to use Apsara's word, terrifying. It's liberating, but it implies something that one of the commentators spoke about with Howard's work, namely that it's like the world has gone to pieces and each component part is now struggling about how to reformulate and recombine. So it's one thing to kill off Renaissance perspectivalism and even to feel that you leave the little chapel as something of the murderer. It's another thing then to be in a kind of anarchic loose end state of trying to put the things back into your own order, which is personal and political. Go ahead, Lauren.
I was
go
going
ahead.
to talk about how Apsara, the original title, you were thinking about it as being, weren't you thinking about it being as a point of balance? Yeah. And then it became a margin of chaos, which are both like brilliant and perfect descriptions for the work and both drawn from the period. And so how to think about both those things, the little bit of chaos, but also that it's always turning on this point of balance. And that's one of the things that I think is hard about Howard's work, is that it doesn't come unhinged. So sort of what I tried to think about is this idea of it not being a nameable style. Like we have names for so many interwar avant-garde styles, and this is one that kind of like escapes. And what does that mean? Do we name all styles by individuals, which you see show up a lot in his work? Like it's kind of like this mixed with this mixed with this is how curators or critics describe it. But what does it sort of mean to escape language, which is what he was also trying to do as a trained journalist, changing to becoming a painter?
Hold on for the mic, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you so much for this exhibit. It should be, attaining international acclaim. There's just no doubt as far as wartime surrealism. It was sort of beneath the wires to me. I found out about it in East Bay Express in a small little ad, And then when I walked in, it was like this erratic follicle precisionism. My question is, on a regional basis, and if it was, Alexander Caldera and Man Ray, and then Howard being exhibited in Europe, 1936, in the exhibition in London, the Surrealism exhibit, then Julian Levy, and then Peggy Guggenheim, as far as just here in the Bay Area, and his affiliation, with WPA doing the posters and such, for the war effort, is he the only surrealist that is from the Bay Area that achieved some sort of fame on the same scale as, like, Max Ernst, Tanguay, Dolly, etc. And then another question, this is multi-layered, as far as social circles too, when you have like Leonore Carrington and Man Ray and Lee Miller and this whole sort of kind of racy, for lack of a better word, it seemed to be more conservative out here with Adeline Kent and Howard. The circle seems to be smaller, and if that's the case, is it because there was only one Bay Area surrealist?
Okay, well, that was a lot, but I'll try and answer some of it. I think that Charles Howard, well, the important thing to note is that he never did receive the fame or the recognition that Man Ray did. But to my knowledge, I don't know if you guys can think of any others, he is the only surrealist artist who went to Europe from the Bay Area and then came back, but then sort of moved back to Europe. There were many other surrealists, as Jeff mentioned, who came to San Francisco. Stanley Hayter and Gordon Onslow Ford as well were living in London, and they came back in 39-40 when all the other surrealists were also fleeing Europe and coming to the United States for safety. And Howard was a really important link in bringing this sort of abstraction that was happening in Europe to the Bay Area. And if you look at, Adeline Kent and Clay Spone and Robert Howard's work, it immediately becomes much more abstract after Howard arrives. And they start adopting these sort of elusive titles as well. I'm thinking of Adeline Kent's Presence, and then some of Robert's work too. They have these sort of single titles that allude to something much larger too. So I think that you see that sort of sense of abstraction that he and others brought to the Bay Area in artists who were working here at that time, and he was a link between abstraction and surrealism and Europe and the Bay Area in that sense.
I think he also made it seem like something that you didn't have to join. Like he would say that like people didn't really think, he thought that Dali would think that he was still a painter and scorn him. So there was a way in which he positioned himself as not really belonging to any particular crowd, which made, I think, people better able to react to his ideas without feeling like they had to join him or create some sort of society. So I can see that resonating in San Francisco in a different way than if he was like a European surrealist.
And it's funny when Julian Levy publishes Surrealism, the book, after the exhibition, he leaves Howard out because he says that Howard was only passingly surrealist. And you could say, and perhaps that was a sanguine mistake, including him, because he was only passingly surrealistic, and you could say a similar thing about Picasso, who was very shortly affiliated with the surrealists. And I would just say that surrealism and categories in particular, is something that Howard really struggled with throughout his life. And even later on, he invents a new category called the ideographic, which we learn about, which is something that he thinks of in order to describe abstraction as being a portrait of an artist's mind. So he was constantly wrestling with categories. And maybe that has something to do with why he wasn't so known.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, his work it's perfectly symmetrical. And there's huge elements of precisionism, you know, so of his father being an architectural background, so it comes down through the family, etc. Just amazing exhibit. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much.
Galen, did you have a question?
So,
I think this is the last question. Is that what you're saying?
oh,
Okay.
okay.
We have
Well,
6 minutes. I think we can.
Okay.
Oh, is someone else?
No. Go ahead.
Yeah. I was just thinking about the question of whether it was true, and I think it is true, that he found it a grueling experience sometimes to paint. That, what was the word? The word drudgery. Yeah, because I think that he really wanted to be original. He did not. He felt very strongly. I'm his niece, so I grew up with some of this. You're supposed to be very original. You're not supposed to copy other people. Even though I know in the catalog he says, you know, you do get ideas from other people. But at the same time, it was really important not to copy, not to be just categorized in a certain way. And I think that that is a harder kind of thing to do than if you're just copying the same shapes you've done over and over and making them hang differently, and or copying birds the way I used to do, pictures of birds. That was easy to. And I just think the kind of work that he did was very difficult and he wanted it to be what he really wanted, as your essay said. So I believe that it was a kind of a drudgery, even though satisfying one. I just wanted to put that 2 bits worth in.
Yeah, I would just add that I think the drudgery comment means that it was work. It was work. He had to go into the studio and really figure it out. You know, it was, you know, he had to work in order to learn how to paint. He was self-taught. So there was this sense that, and that these things don't necessarily come easily when they're really good. Like, he was really trying to tap into something that was larger than himself. And, you know, he says that he did so many drawings in his mind before he even put them down to paper, and was also doing automatic drawings and this sort of thing. So it was sort of like a struggle where you, in order to produce a great work, you know, you had to work at it.
Like an obsession.
Yeah,
Use that
which
word.
he says, you know, my obsession. Yeah.
Okay, last question. Let's get the mic back.
Thank you very much for a really interesting and exciting afternoon. I'm thrilled to be here and be part of it. One of the original questions asked tonight was, why is he overlooked so deeply? I've read all sorts of books, and he rarely appears in publications, and he's still relatively unknown. He shouldn't be. I just wondered, what would be your takes, some of your simplistic, or because you can't get very deep into it, but why he hasn't translated to today as much as other people in his era?
Okay, so let's have each person say two or three sentences on that. It's a good question.
Okay. Well, I tried to answer this question a little bit in my essay, too. So this is something that I open up with in my essay as a question that I'm posing. But I think there are many different factors, some of which have already been articulated. One, that he was resistant to categories and association and groups, you know, and it's really through his affiliation with the Surrealists that is such an important thing, which is how we know him, because he was included in those exhibitions. So affiliation and association was so important at that moment, but it was something that he was sort of resistant to at the same time. And then another aspect is that he was an American working abroad, and so he gets written out of the American narratives, and he gets written out of the British narratives because he's American. So he appears in footnotes for, Charles Harrison's tome on British modernism, because maybe that's because he wasn't British, although he does become a British citizen and later on, 1963, but he really lived most of his life in England. So he should be seen of in that context, but he should also be seen in the American context. So he was between geographies in a certain sense. So I think that was a factor too.
It's not uncommon. So Howard, like a number of artists, and as art historians, we're constantly plowing through material, and in the process of looking at someone, we find someone else that kind of is in the same gap, and it's a bit paradoxical and somewhat contingent on the way journalism spins threads, the way movements are created. If you fall outside of a group, and if you're not a part of a group, you run the risk of being marginalized, or if not being marginalized, just forgotten as time moves on. And it's not uncommon, in the course of the greater art history arc.
I mean, I think what's more moving to me is to think about how we can rediscover him. And in part, we rediscovered him because Apsara did the work of pulling together all these things from these collections and also from family collections. So until you have like a catalog resonate, until you have a pulling together of what's out there, it's hard to even know like what's not out there, what might be lost, what might have been lost in Europe, what we might still be able to find. But at least now we kind of know what we're looking for and that we should be looking for it, which a lot of artists, the work disappears or the family sells it or they burn it, or like it's here at least we have enough work and enough work that's in museums. It's like he achieved just the right amount of fame, but like not enough. So it's been great to rediscover it too.
Yeah, I agree with that, and then just want to reiterate that period that he is here from 40 to 46. It's pretty stunning. I mean, Germaine McKagy is considered, and Grace McCann Morley are considered some of the most amazing curators that ever lived. When Walter Hopps writes about the great curators that he knew, and it's Germaine McKagy, and so that's it. Yes, and so you realize that these people are paying attention to him, not just his artwork, but his psyche. Those things that are buried within those paintings. So he was very important in that window, which probably is enough in many respects, but all the rest of it, and thanks to the show.
All right, well, that's a great last word from Jeff. Thank you, all the panelists. Thank you, everyone.
And I just want to echo the thanks to the panelists, because I feel like I've been talking about Howard so much myself and to myself for so long that it's so nice to hear you guys talk about it. So thank you for joining us.